Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's Cynicalex, and you asked for it, so here it is. 116 artifacts. We are going to rank all of them. This is a gargantuan effort, and I couldn't have done it without the very handy icons over at thanosvibs.money. So big shout out to them for doing that and allowing people to download that stuff very easily, rather than this taking me like an hour data mining or more. The files of MFF, this took me like 10 minutes while I was listening to some music. So thank you so much to them for making this video way easier to set up and prep for than it should have been. And of course, if you want to make your own tier list, I'm going to leave the link down below in the description. So yeah, if you want your favorite content creator and it's not me to make their own, just encourage them to do that. So there's a lot of artifacts. There's a lot of artifacts. Some of them are going to look weird because they're the base models of the character, so you might have to do a little bit of homework here. But there's way too many, so we're just going to start in big batches, and I'll just go through as I'm dragging the characters along, explaining basically why they're in one category or another. So basically, the first two categories that we're going to start off with is bad and okay. And okay is a mixture of the character being okay and the artifact being okay, and bad is either the artifact is just dog shit or most likely what happens is the artifact is not very good and the character is not very good. And this actually happens really frequently. Unfortunately, we just see the devs not putting any effort into artifacts for like quote-unquote bad characters, which is a real shame. It is a real shame, but it happens a lot, and so this is kind of the situation that we're in. Like a lot of the transcended characters, for example, that never get a uniform and just get a transcendence suddenly because they're part of an update with another character, they oftentimes get very boring, very copy-pasted artifact effects that essentially do nothing. Like, you know, 20% attack for a 6-star artifact is hella useless, right? 20% attack for a character who has stats from 7 years ago and basically cannot function in today's meta is not really going to do anything meaningful for the character. So that basically sums up the bad category. It almost exclusively applies to bad characters, but it also applies to characters like, even for example, Icarus. Okay, I'll give you a couple of examples. There are a few examples of characters who are good but have really bad artifacts. So Kate Bishop, Icarus, and Doctor Strange are really good examples. Wong is also a really good example. And basically, their artifacts are just very conditional. And they're all actually very similar as well. They're very conditional, and they also just don't apply very good effects for the content that you're going to be using them in. So besides Icarus, who's mostly a leadership with a smidge of PvP, you want to use Doctor Strange and you want to use Kate Bishop where they're going to do the most, you know, damage, and where they're going to be the most effective, which is PvE. But their artifacts trigger iframe ignore. That's mostly for PvP, guys. That's almost exclusively a PvP thing. And so you have a situation where it's just basically useless, and that's unfortunately where we're at with that. Sorry, there are a few more here. Luna comes in at the bottom of okay. For the most part, I'm not ranking these as far as you know, I'm not ranking them within, but I am highlighting at the top, at the very front, some of the good ones, and at the rear, some of the bad ones. We're just going to flash forward now. So there we go. We flash forward ahead to being wrapped up with the okay and bad categories. As you can see, this is the majority of the artifacts in the game. Now, I do want to highlight a few before we move on, but basically, in my opinion, these are the lower half of the artifacts that you should almost never consider using a selector on, because of the way that artifacts are and how difficult they are to get and just what they do for the character. Now, of course, if you're a big fan of a character, if you're trying to hit rank 1 or you just want to make them as strong as possible, you're going to use a selector, but this is just the most efficient and the sort of most min-max approach to it. This isn't necessarily going to be the best approach for every player. But I did try to rank them as best as I could in the top row for each bad and okay to give you a bit more context. And then as far as mentioning a few that I really think are important, I do want to mention most of the first line in the okay category, because there are some meta hitters here. Moon Knight tier 4, Venom tier 4, Ant-Man tier 4, Captain America, Sharon Rogers tier 4, Scarlet Witch tier 3. Now here's the thing. These characters are all very good, The problem is that their artifacts just don't do enough for them. Their artifacts have decent effects, but they are not really game-changing effects. And then on the other hand, most of these characters are not at the very top of the meta for their respective category. And again, no surprise here, we see a lot of male heroes, we see a lot of combat types and speed types, and then of course Blast female hero is also not a very restricted type. Scarlet Witch is popular for ABX and ABL, but unfortunately, like, her artifact is pretty good, but at this point in time, with the Marvels coming around the corner and other content, I wouldn't invest in her artifact at a high level with something like an artifact selector. Right? I did that a couple years ago. I think that's kind of, the time has passed there. And then another good example I want to give you guys, because we will be ranking him much higher. MODOK and Dr. Octopus have the exact same artifact effect, and frankly there's a lot of characters that have the same artifact effect, so you may be confused a little bit seeing characters with the same effect low as characters with the same effect who are ranked very high. Well, then that leads into the character being very strong, right? So whereas MODOK and Echo are not very strong, but they have matching artifact effects with Dr. Octopus and Spider-Man, the difference being Dr. Octopus and Spider-Man are extremely meta, and therefore their artifacts value goes up exponentially. So there are cases of strong artifacts on characters who are weaker, and that's mostly what we're looking at with some of the characters in OK, or they're very strong characters with pretty good artifacts, but not mind-blowingly good artifacts, and also they're not meta for a specific category, so it's not as important. Now, the next category, when we start to really get into the important stuff, it's the needs artifact. So if you're going to be building these characters, in my opinion, you should consider building a lot of these characters, I think they need their artifact. So it's very straightforward here. I think this is where people really start to lean forward in their chair as they're listening, and this is where the advice starts to get a lot more tailored. So here I put Thor and Magic, and I'll explain as I go along, but I will throw in a lot more here so that we can go through and explain and you can get a better idea. We have Emma Frost, we have Mr. Sinister, and essentially these characters here, their artifact provides such a polarizingly strong effect that if you're going to build these characters, you need the artifact. Now, of course, you don't need the artifact in any, like, there's no FOMO here. I'm not telling you have to go and get the artifact for these characters. But in my opinion, if you genuinely want to play these characters at a high level and you want them to perform, whether it's in PvP or PvE, and I'll specify for each one, you sort of need the artifact. And again, there's a bit of room for interpretation here, but we're going to go through and talk about it. So for Thor, the fact that he is one of the best, if not the best farming characters, hinges on the fact that you have his artifact, at least at 4 stars, because it allows him to convert his lightning resist leadership into a lightning damage buff. That's very important. Otherwise, he has no lead, like no buffing lead without his artifact, which makes him substantially slower than some other options. Now, you can get around this to an extent with the set dealer feature, but Valkyrie is an amazing support for him. White Fox is the de facto best support for him, so you don't really want to sub out either one of those for a Beta Ray Bill or a Cyclops or something like that. So I do think his artifact is needed. And then for Magic, Mr. Sinister, Wolverine, and Hela, their artifacts are all exactly the same. It's the Immortality artifact, and in my opinion, all of these characters can do decently for you in PvP. They all have PvP traits like iframe ignore, counterattack, etc., penetration, but they need the artifact in order to function in PvP. Similarly, Emma Frost gets her patented Reflect from her artifact. That's basically a must-have if you're going to use her in PvP, and Cersei gets a Revive, also an extremely clutch ability for PvP. Juggernaut and Gilgamesh both get a massive HP boost plus a heal, so their artifacts are fantastic. Absorbing Man, again, Destroyer get healing based on their Reflect, and they do energy and physical Reflect respectively, so that is also very important for PvP to allow them to heal more, to reflect more. Heimdall gets Ignore Dodge and a heal, also very good. Black Widow, as her value declines in PvE, I think a lot of people are going to be switching over and seeing if she can work in PvP, particularly since she has that really good tier 4 ability where she dodges 30 attacks. Just straight up. It's even better than Spider-Man's artifact, but her artifact is also like Spider-Man's because it gives her that dodge. So she can actually stack a crazy amount of dodge, which is very strong. And then Deadpool, honestly, he probably shouldn't be here, but he does technically have a PvP artifact, and I think he's going to get a rework eventually, but honestly at this point his artifact is much better suited to being down here because he's not good enough to utilize it properly, and it's honestly kind of a bad artifact effect. I just wanted to highlight that he kind of needs it. Next category here, very straightforward as well. These are support artifacts. These are just artifacts that provide buffs to characters other than the character that is equipping the artifact. So these are always in demand. These are always good artifacts to consider picking up because they help you buff your characters. They help you buff your teammates around you. And that's always really strong. And these are always, you know, on characters who already have buffs. So it's not like they're given to characters who have no ability to buff their allies. Whether it's a leadership or whether it's a passive ability, all of these technically are buffs. I believe that is every single one. I'm not missing any. It's trust me guys, it's difficult to memorize what all the artifacts do, but there we go. That's the list there for the artifacts. You can sort of rearrange the value. Some people will argue that some are more valuable than others. Like, you know, M'Baku has a more generic artifact, which means it applies to all characters. That's more valuable. Other people will say, oh, you know, Agent Venom's is much stronger because it has a really good effect for symbiotes like Venom and Carnage. And also Agent Venom is a much stronger character. You feel free to sort of move these around as you wish. But yeah, the two biggies that you want to consider always picking up are Valkyrie and Black Cat. I have a 6-star Black Cat. I only have a 3-star Valkyrie artifact, so I'm considering getting Valkyrie's 6-star artifact with my selector, to be honest with you, because I already got a 6-star for Agent Venom, and I got a 4-star for M'Baku. She-Hulk is only for Gamma allies, but that's great for Hulk, and she still has a slamming leadership. Sunbird only for the Warriors of the Sky, but of course it's the revive, which is, you know, hella important. Then you have Robbie Reyes with the flame ability allies. When they use attacks, they get buffs. Spider sense abilities for Scarlet Spider, they get a chance to cleanse. And then for Nadia, it's actually a heal when allies use an ability. So we got some quite nice ones here. Again, they are ranked in terms of how good they are. So the weakest ones are sort of at the end here, and the strongest ones are at the beginning. And with that, we sort of come to the heaviest hitters. Now, these are the ones where you're getting into serious talk here. So now we have Needs Artifact, but it's a little bit different because they are meta. I know that sounds like, oh, he's copying and pasting, but the difference here is not all of these characters are meta, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you Heimdall is meta, Wolverine is not meta, Cersei is not meta. There are a couple of characters here who are meta. Well, mostly just Thor. He's basically the only one that's meta here, Thor and Black Widow. But these characters are like firmly in the meta, but they also need their artifact to be meta. So that's where we sort of see these characters crop up. And there's not that many of them, but we do need to highlight them in my opinion because it's very important. So yes, Carnage, absolutely very good for PvP, but he absolutely under no circumstances can function without his artifact. So he needs the artifact. Adam Warlock, same thing. He needs the heal to be good in PvP. Spider-Man needs the artifact to be good for PvP as well because it gives him that dodge. And then in my opinion, I think Blue Dragon does need the artifact to do the maximum amount of damage, whether it is in PvE or PvP, since it applies sort of across the board there. And that's kind of an important thing for her because she needs that high burst damage. But that's basically it. And then we come to the PvP meta. These are just PvP meta characters who have good artifacts. Now, I do want to stress one thing about this ranking. The characters at the top here for PvP and PvE meta, they don't technically need their artifacts. So this is where the tier list is kind of, it's not really inverted, but it's sort of like a parabola, right? You go from the worst ones that you definitely don't want, and then in the middle of the parabola, in the middle of the tier list, you get the ones that you sort of are the most valuable and the most needed. And then at the other end of the parabola, you have characters that are just so stupidly strong that they can make it work. They can still dominate the game without an artifact. Does the artifact help? Sure. Is the artifact going to allow you to push to the highest tier for these characters? Sure. But do you need the artifact? No. You don't need the artifact for these characters unless what you need to do is those things that I just mentioned, right? Pushing the top ranks, hitting the highest damage caps, whatever, pushing the hardest content, etc., right? So, increased damage to bosses, whatever kind of, I can't remember what kind of buffs he has. Increased damage to bosses, some other buffs, increased damage to aliens and creatures, same thing here. elemental damage, you know, attack and ignore dodge, I think. Instinct, crit rate, crit damage, some shit like that. And then increased attack there for Green Goblin, increased damage to supervillains and superheroes for her, a massive chunk of max HP, and then increased damage to supervillains and superheroes. Again, very good artifacts, very good effects, and when you give a good effect to an extremely powerful character, whoa, it's like, you know, pouring gravy on your meal, right? On your delicious meal. I don't have a better analogy for you right now. But on the other hand, I want to stress that these are not needed artifacts. These characters can still function very well without their artifacts. However, I do think that you should consider building, like, the way that I would approach this, if it was my first time buying an artifact or it was my first time using an artifact selector, I would probably consider getting one from the PvE meta, and then I would either consider getting one from the PvP meta, or if you're not into PvP, I would consider getting one from the support artifact meta if you only had two choices, which there are two selectors in the bingo, so that's kind of my approach to it. But yeah, that's the list. I know it was a long video. Thanks for sticking with it. Hit me up in the comments down below. This is massive, and yeah, it's that's what she said. Thanks for watching. Smash the like button, like I said. Helps out the channel tremendously, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.